Read to you from one of my new favorite Bibles of the Apocalypse, and this is actually part 2 of this week's sermon from my Humpty Dumpty tribe hero John Steinbeck's Travels with Charley in Search of America. I just finished an opening rant that I encourage you to listen to before listening to this, where Steinbeck's biographer, a fellow named J. Perini, gives his impressions of this book and the introduction to this book. So whether or not you have ever read this excellent book, and if you have not, you need to, I suggest you go look at that video. I'll put the link to it here in the description of this video. I encourage you to listen to it first, but whether or not you decide to listen to that. So in this sermon, I'm going just to read a few passages from the first half of Travels with Charley, and these, just real quickly, not to repeat myself too much from the introduction, this was John Steinbeck traveling around the country in late 1960 is when these impressions were being recorded in the fall of the year 1960, when it was, who was it? Kennedy versus Nixon, I believe. So what was the state of America 46 or 56 years ago? Here is the state of American cities 56 years ago. American cities are like badger holes ringed with trash, all of them surrounded by piles of wrecked and rusting automobiles and almost smothered with rubbish. Everything we use comes in boxes, cartons, bins, the so-called packaging we love so much. The mountains of things we throw away are much greater than the things we use. In this, if in no other way, we can see the wild and reckless exuberance of our production, and waste seems to be the index. Driving along, I thought how in France or Italy, every item of these thrown out things would have been saved and used for something. This is not said in criticism of one system or the other, yeah, right, but I do wonder whether there will come a time when we can no longer afford our wastefulness. Chemical waste in the rivers, metal waste everywhere, and atomic waste buried deep in the earth or sunk in the sea. When an Indian village became too deep in its own filth, the inhabitants moved. We have no place which to move. Can you imagine what that rant would sound like in 2016? So he continues this theme of wastefulness as he's driving through New England. It's after Labor Day, so all of the antique shops, he has a problem with these bullshit antique shops, so they're closed for the winter. I can never get used to the thousands of antique shops along the roads, all bulging with authentic and attested trash from an earlier time. I believe the population of the 13 colonies was less than 4 million souls, and every one of them must have been frantically turning out tables, chairs, china, glass, candle molds, and oddly shaped bits of iron, copper, and brass for future sale to 20th century tourists. There are enough antiques for sale along the roads of New England alone to furnish the houses of a population of 50 million people. If I were a good businessman and carried a title for and cared a tittle for my unborn great-grandchildren, which I do not, I would gather all the junk in the wrecked automobiles, comb the city dumps, and pile these gleanings in mountains and spray the whole thing with that stuff the Navy uses to mothball ships. At the end of 100 years, my descendants would be permitted to open this treasure trove and would be the antique kings of the world. If the battered, cracked, and broken stuff of our ancestors tried to get rid of now brings so much money, just think what a 1954 Oldsmobile or a 1960 Toastmaster will bring, and a vintage wearing mixer. Lord, the possibilities are endless. Things we have to pay to have hauled away could bring fortunes. If I seem to be over-interested in junk, it is because I am. And I have a lot of it too. Half a garage full of bits and broken pieces. I use these things for repairing other things. Recently, I stopped my car in front of the display yard of a junk dealer. As I was looking courteously at his stock, it suddenly occurred to me that I had more junk than he had. But it can be seen that I have a genuine and almost miserly interest in worthless objects. My excuse is that in this era of planned obsolescence, when a thing breaks down, I can usually find something in my collection to repair it. A toilet, or a motor, or a lawnmower. But I guess the real truth is that I simply like junk. Okay, from junk, he talks about the invasion of plastic taking over the country. In 1960, I'm often quoting the 1967 movie The Graduate, when Mr. Braddock telling, I think, anyway, who was it, advising Benjamin to invest in plastics. Well, this was 7 years before, when plastics were just hitting America. So this is what plastics looked like to John Steinbeck 7 years before The Graduate. Not far outside of Bangor, Maine, I stopped at an auto court and rented a room. It wasn't expensive. The sign said greatly reduced winter rates. It was immaculate. Everything was done in plastics. The floors, the curtains, tabletops of stainless, burnless plastics, lampshades made of plastic. Only the bedding and the towels were of a natural material. I went to the small restaurant run in conjunction. It was all plastic too. The table linen, the butter dish, the sugar and crackers were wrapped in cellophane, the jelly in a small plastic coffin sealed with cellophane. It was early evening and I was the only customer. Even the waitress wore a sponge-off apron. She wasn't happy, but she wasn't unhappy. She wasn't anything. But I don't believe anyone is a nothing. There has to be something inside, if only to keep the skin from collapsing. This vacant eye, listless hand, this damask cheek dusted like a donut, with plastic powder had to have a memory or a dream. And then he reports this depressing conversation he had with this waitress. Strange how one person can saturate a room with vitality, with excitement. Then there are others, and this dame was one of them, who can drain off energy and joy, can suck pleasure dry, and get no sustenance from it. Such people spread a grayness in the air about them. She got to me. I felt so blue and miserable, I wanted to crawl into a plastic cover and die. What a date she must be. What a lover. I tried to imagine this last and couldn't. For a moment, I considered giving her a $5 tip, but I knew what would happen. She wouldn't be glad. She would just think I was crazy. From his rant to plastic to his rant about hunting. I could not have escaped hunting if I had wanted to, for open seasons spangle the autumn. We have inherited many attitudes from our recent ancestors who wrestled this continent as Jacob wrestled the angel and the pioneers won. From them, we take a belief that every American is a natural-born hunter, and every fall a great number of men set out to prove that without talent, training, knowledge, or practice, they are dead shots with rifle or shotgun. The results are horrid. From the moment I left Sag Harbor, the guns were booming at the migrating ducks, and as I drove in Maine, the rifle shots in the forest would have frightened off any number of redcoats so long as they didn't know what was happening. This is bound to get me a bad name as a sportsman, but let me say at once that I have nothing against the killing of animals. Something has to kill them, I suppose. And then he talks about how it's totally fine. He has no problem if these guys are out hunting for meat to feed their families. But it isn't hunger that drives millions of armed American males to forest and hills every autumn, as the high incidence of heart failure among the hunters will prove. Somehow, the hunting process has to do with masculinity, but I don't know how. I know there are any number of good and efficient hunters who know what they are doing, but many more are overweight gentlemen primed with whiskey and armed with high-powered rifles. They shoot at anything that moves or look as though it might, and their success in killing one another may well prevent a population explosion. If the casualties were limited to their own kind, there would be no problem. But the slaughter of cows, pigs, farmers, dogs, and highway signs makes autumn a dangerous season in which to travel. A farmer in upper New York State painted the word cow in big black letters on both sides of his white bossy, but the hunters shot it anyway. In Wisconsin, as I was driving through, a hunter shot his own guide between the shoulder blades. The coroner, questioning this Nimrod, asked, "Did you think he was a deer?" "Yes, sir, I did." "But you weren't sure he was a deer?" "Well, no, sir, I guess not." So he goes from ranting about the about hunters to talking about the demise of small rural villages and the rise of big cities as more and more people abandon the countryside to move to the city. Of course, he moved to New York City, where he spent most of his time in the biggest city in the whole country, bitching about people moving to cities. Anyway, I remember that this huge area, talking about areas of New England, had once been much more settled and was now abandoned to the creeping forest, the animals, the lumber camps, and the cold. The big towns are getting bigger and the villages smaller. The hamlet store, whether grocery, general, hardware, clothing, cannot compete with the supermarket and the chain organization. This was years before Walmart. Our treasured and nostalgic picture of the village general store, the Cracker Barrel store, where an informed yeomanry gather to express opinions and formulate the national character, is very rapidly disappearing. People who once held family fortresses against wind and weather, against scourges of frost and drought and insect enemies, now cluster against the busy beast of the big town. The new American finds his challenge and his love in traffic-choked streets, skies nested in smog, choking with the acids of industry, the screech of rubber, and houses leashed in against one another, while the townlets wither a time and die. And this, as I found, is as true in Texas as in Maine. As the small towns yield to the big city, the city bleeds its substance, where the logs, talking about a logging town, Millinocket, Maine, where the logs are ground up, the air smells of chemicals, the rivers are choked and poisoned, and the streets swarm with this happy, hurrying breed. This is not offered in criticism, but only as observation, if I had my bullshit button detector. And I am sure that as all pendulums reverse their swing, so eventually the swollen cities ruptured like dehiscent wounds and disperse their children back to the countryside. This prophecy is underwritten by the tendency of the rich to do this already. Where the rich lead, the poor will follow or try to. I wish I had highlighted his prophecy about migrants, where he makes the prophecy that although he is a left-winger, you know, good God, many books written about the migrant farm worker, he understood better than anybody, unfortunately, I didn't underline the scene, predicting at some point the backlash against migrants in the coming years as we roll out the red carpet to them in 1960. Well, let's see what it looks like a few years down the road. Sorry I didn't underline that passage. And I'm going to close with his rant on interstate highways, which were just beginning in 1960. The internet internet. Interstate highway system, I think, just began in the Eisenhower administration, just a few years before Steinbeck wrote Travels with Charley. This was his opinion of this trend. From the beginning of my journey, I had avoided the great high-speed slashes of concrete and tar called throughways or superhighways. Various states have different names for them, but I had dawdled in New England. The winter grew apace, and I had visions of being snowbound in North Dakota, so I sought out US 90. This was not even an interstate highway, a wide gash of a superhighway, multiple lane carrier of the nation's goods. Rocinante bucketed along. The minimum speed on this road was greater than any I had previously driven. I drove into a wind quartering in from my starboard bow and felt the buffeting, sometimes staggering blows of the gale I helped make. I could hear the sough of it on the square surfaces of my camper top. Instructions screamed at me from the road. Do not stop. No stopping. Maintain speed. Trucks as long as freighters went roaring by, delivering a wind like the blow of a fist. These great roads are wonderful for moving goods, but not for inspection of a countryside. You are bound to the wheel and your eyes to the car ahead of you and to the rear view mirror for the car behind and the side mirror for the truck about to pass. And at the same time, you must read all the signs for fear you may miss some instruction or order. No roadside stands selling squash juice, no antique stores, no farm products or factory outlets. When we get these throughways built across the whole country, as we will and must, it will be possible to drive from New York to California without seeing a single thing. At intervals, there are places of rest and recreation, food, fuel and oil, postcards, steam table food, picnic tables, garbage cans, all fresh and newly painted, restrooms and lavatories so spotless, so incensed with deodorants and with detergents that it takes a time to get your sense of smell back. For deodorants are not quite correctly named. They just substitute one smell for another, and the substitute must be much stronger and more penetrating than the odor it conquers. I had neglected my own country too long. Civilization had made great strides in my absence. It, meaning 1960, is life at the peak of some kind of civilization. The restaurant accommodation, great scallops of counters with simulated leather stools are as spotless as, and not unlike, the lavatories. Everything that can be captured and held down is sealed in clear plastic. The food is oven fresh, spotless, and tasteless, untouched by human hands. I remembered with an ache certain dishes in France and Italy touched by innumerable human hands. And I was going to read his closing scene to part one of his story about Lonesome Harry, but I might leave that to another rant. probably come back at you when I finish the book about Steinbeck's vision of loneliness, but that will be another rant. But for this edition of my Doomsday sermon, come here, come here and say hi to the folks. This is old Hambone Littletail, aka Don Quixote, and his little travel buddy Sancho travels with Sancho, and that will be an ongoing story, and this is just one chapter of it. If you have not read Travels with Charley by John Steinbeck, do yourself a favor, get it now.